This is Cast of Wonders, the fiction podcast for young adults featuring stories of the fantastic. Welcome. Episode 167 for June 28th, 2015. Hello everyone. This week we present Setting My Spider Free by Carolyn M. Yoakum, originally published in Electric Velocipede issues 17 and 18, spring 2009. If the title wasn't enough of a clue, the story that follows features spiders, front and center. Arachnophobes may want to skip this episode and join us again next week. Carolyn M. Yoakum lives in Seattle and loves cold, cloudy weather. She's the author of dozens of short stories appearing in Lightspeed, Asimov's, Clarkesworld, and Daily Science Fiction, among other places. Her story, 4 Seasons in the Forest of Your Mind, is in the current May-June issue of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and she has stories forthcoming in Lightspeed, Beneath Ceaseless Skies, and Fireside Magazine. You can follow her on Twitter as @Carolyn Yoakum, and her website is the same, carolynyoakum.com. As always, we'll put links for you in the show notes. The story is narrated for you by Amy Robison, a veteran voiceover talent and actress from Atlanta, Georgia. You may recognize her voice from several excellent narrations around the fiction podcast community and on our own previous episode 130, The Phobos Monolith, from last year. Amy will be appearing on the Rookery Radio Hour on July 20th. We'll put a link for you to the Facebook event in the show notes, along with her website and Twitter accounts. And now, we've a tale to tell.
Setting My Spider Free by Carolyn M. Yoakum. Cool air swirled in through the window and carried with it the faint tapping of claws scratching against stone. A spiderling was climbing my tower.
Lily Mia stirred.
She'd spent the daylight hours in her corner with all her legs fanned out across the floor, trying to ward off the summer heat. My poor spider. Her fur, so thick and comforting in the winter, was patchy and ragged. Clumps of it gathered along the base of the walls, and thick strands clung to the grimy sweat on my skin. The spiderling appeared on my windowsill. It was medium-sized, bigger than a loaf of bread,
but 100th the size of Lily Mia.
I didn't want it to disturb the webs that decorated my walls, so I reached up and grabbed it with both hands. The spiderling twirled its legs in the empty air as it tried to cool itself. Mama had overburdened it. There was a chunk of dark chocolate fastened to one of its hind legs, and Gran's gathering box was tied to its back. The box was exquisite, covered on the outside with gray spider leather. Gran had soaked the leather to make it soft, and then carved each panel with delicate patterns. The designs were inspired by the webs of her first spider. I shifted the spiderling until its weight rested on my hip and untied the twine that held the gathering box in place. Gran had given me the box last summer before she died. She was such a remarkable woman. Her leatherwork was beautiful, but it was more than that. She'd had a contentedness about her after she came down from her tower. She had done what she wanted with her life. I set the box on my table next to a stack of half-finished sheet music. The spiderling on my hip squirmed, calling me out of my reverie. I took the chocolate from its leg and popped it into my mouth. The bittersweet taste reminded me of pain. Pain, of course,
reminded me of Lily Mia.
Her name meant beautiful pain, and it suited her. She'd watched from her corner while I'd unloaded the gathering box and the chocolate, but seeing me eat reminded her that she was hungry too. She snatched up the spiderling from my hip with one foreleg. It was barely big enough to be an appetizer.
I had a hard time believing that Lily Mia had ever been so small.
It wouldn't be long before she'd grown too large for our tower chamber,
even though its single room was bigger than all of Mama's cottage,
with a ceiling 3 times as high.
The spiderling did not diminish Lily Mia's hunger.
She slid her legs out along the wall, brushing against the strands of web that stretched from the floor to the ceiling in intricate patterns. The crystal strands were valuable,
but what I loved were the designs that Lily Mia spun.
The sparkling lines curved and intertwined to create the impression of a river overflowing after the spring rains. I stroked a strand of web, careful not to sweep it off the wall. Touching it gave me strength against pain, and I would need my strength.
Lily Mia lifted herself off the floor.
Her movement sent wisps of fur swirling around the room and into the webs. I'd need to clean before she started to spin again, but she wouldn't wait for me to do it now. I stepped away from the wall into the center of the room. She circled me. I was half her size, and she could devour me if she wanted to. I held my arms out to her, forearms raised above my head and hands bent backwards to expose my wrists.
Lily Mia drove her fangs down through my palms.
She pushed down through my hands and into my wrists. I tried not to move, only to breathe. Tears welled up, but I did not cry. I tilted my head backwards. Inhale, exhale. My wrists swelled with the fullness of her fangs. They burned from her venom. She pulled away and left behind a throbbing emptiness. The room slipped in and out of focus.
Lily Mia lowered her mouth to my palms and kissed out my blood.
She drank deeply, then pulled away from me. My wrists burned. I staggered to the wall and gathered a handful of web. With a slow and constant pull, I tore the web from the wall, careful not to break the strands, so even the web that was high above my head came free as part of a single woven cloth.
It gave Lily Mia a clean canvas and also let me wrap the old webs around my wounded wrists to dull the pain.
Far too soon, I forced myself to slide the webs off my arms.
I plucked out the bits of Lily Mia's fur and put the web into Gran's gathering box. Lily Mia danced her artwork onto my walls, and I had no thought to spare on anything else.
Music churned inside me as I watched her. Each thread became a note. I sang as she spun, and the web vibrated with my voice as the notes poured out of me. This would be our song,
Lily Mia's and mine,
the culmination of all of our efforts.
Lily Mia kept spinning,
a cascade of strands flowing over the stones and crashing against the floor. It was splashing water, mist and rainbows, a symphony of nature drawn in crystal and echoed in my voice. Then my notes fell away from the pattern. My voice faltered. Pain shot through my wrists. I fell against the wall and pressed my forearms against the stones above my head. The pressure reopened my wounds. My back arched, and waves of pain released waves of tears, flooding into my eyes and down my face. The pain sucked out my breath. I gasped for air, and with each breath I could taste the salt of my tears. Inhale, inhale. I sputtered and coughed. My blood stained the web, and my body blocked off part of the wall.
But Lily Mia danced around me. When Lily Mia was finished, she went back to her corner.
I followed her and snuggled into her fur. She smelled like chamomile. I focused on the smell and on her softness against my bare skin. I tried to ignore the pain in my arms. I may have slept. I don't remember.
When I pulled away from Lily Mia's fur,
it was morning. Mama sent up a spiderling. She sent milk chocolate, which was sickly sweet, and I hated that. Mama knew it, too, and it was her way of telling me how disappointed she was that I hadn't sent down any music. She'd never wanted me to choose this life. She'd never forgiven Gran for loving her spiders more than her children. It wasn't true, of course, but it was what Mama thought. In her eyes, I abandoned her, too. Mama's bitterness made me wonder whether I wanted to come down from my tower between spiders. How could I start a family if all I did was hurt them? I unloaded the rest of the supplies that Mama sent, put away the nuts and berries and bread.
Lily Mia ate the spiderling.
The hunk of milk chocolate sat on my table, an inedible reminder of my failure to produce music. Next to it was Gran's gathering box. She had turned her webs into art. I picked up the box, stroked the soft leather. Maybe there was music in her leather work. I held the box before me and tried to sing its patterns. High notes flowed from my throat, then lower ones, but the melody eluded me. There was something lost when we made art from the spider's webs. Something different went into the leather than what I wove into my songs. And yet, for all its incompleteness, Gran's leather work felt whole. My songs were lacking something. Last night's web was still clear on the walls. Lily Mia had not moved enough to get her fur all over everything. The webs shimmered in the morning light. Maybe this time I could hold on to the song. My voice rang out strong and true, the same melody as before. As I sang, my eyes traced the strands, but I found myself pulled to the spot where my blood stained the web, where my form disrupted part of the pattern. The song was ruined. I ripped down the webs and added them to Gran's gathering box. Mama could sell it at market. Maybe that would appease her. I whistled for a spiderling, one strong enough to carry Gran's box. The scratch of legs on stone came drifting up the wall, and a particularly large spiderling climbed onto my windowsill. It squirmed at the sight of Lily Mia, lifting 1 or 2 legs at a time and then putting them back down in the same place, something I'd never seen a spiderling do before. I didn't think they were that smart. Or maybe it wasn't so smart. Lily Mia only got to eat the incoming spiderlings. I needed the outgoing spiderlings to take things down to the ground. I fastened the box to the spiderling's back and wrote a note to Mama reminding her that I preferred dark chocolate. It scurried back down the wall of my tower. If it lived long enough, that spiderling might make a good spider. It wouldn't have to last much longer if it wanted to be mine. Lily Mia was getting too big for my tower. If I didn't let her go soon, she wouldn't fit through the window. But I still hadn't captured her art. Several days passed. There were dirty webs on the walls again, and Lily Mia slunk around the edges of the room. She stared at me as she moved. I looked down at my wrists, only partially healed from her last feeding. Her venom used to help me heal faster, but either I was becoming immune or she was feeding so often it didn't matter. Could I put myself through the dark chocolate pain that released Lily Mia's beauty? I trailed my fingers along my forearm. I wanted to climb out my window and down to the ground. I hated my pain more than I loved it, and I wanted Mama to hold me. I wanted to quit. Lily Mia's movement changed. She was not pacing now, but stalking around the room. There was a pattern inside of her that wanted to get out. It made her predatory and fierce. Seeing her made me yearn for the pattern too. I had to see this through. My palms started to sweat. What if I couldn't give enough of myself to sustain her? I was running out of self to give. I looked up at a tiny patch of star-encrusted sky. The window was wide, but only an arm's length tall, a window fit for a prison. Lily Mia was my prisoner. I held her here in the darkness of my tower. She spun webs just for me so that I could write the music of her art, but she was growing beyond this room. Her patterns were too big to be contained. Even if I couldn't capture her song, I had to let her go. She circled the tower so fast that fur flew everywhere and her last pattern was peeled from the walls. I should have taken down the webs yesterday. I had no excuse. Mama had sent Gran's gathering box back up after she'd emptied it. I studied it, so perfect in the center of my table. How had Gran done it? How had she found the essence of the webs? What was Lily Mia's song? It was time to let her go, but I wasn't ready. I was so close. My eyes caught Lily Mia's, and she was still. We could go together, at least part way. She stood below my window, and I climbed onto her back. Her fur was warm against my bare feet. The sky stretched out above me as I poked my head outside. I pushed off from Lily Mia and scurried up the rock wall like the spiderlings did. There were plenty of handholds and footholds, and it was an easy climb. Moonlight gave the top of the tower a silver glow. Under the endless stars, I felt insignificant and small, so I turned over and pressed my stomach onto the cool stone. I stuck my head out over the edge and looked down. The window was such a tiny slit. Lily Mia's forelegs appeared in the center of the sill, close together at first, then she spread them wider. Her first pair of mid-legs appeared, one on each side of the forelegs. For a moment, Lily Mia's body blocked the entire window. She was flexible, and she collapsed herself into a shape she'd never been before, long and flat. 2 heartbeats later, she was on the roof with me. She crawled behind me and let me lean against her. Reassured by her presence, I looked out across the world beyond my tower, beneath the starry sky. Other towers rose up from the land, delicate like spider legs. As a child, I'd seen many towers from the ground, but they looked different from up here, closer together somehow. I'd spent long enough inside that I had forgotten I was not alone in my loneliness. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed that threads of crystal bridged the gap between some of the towers. Many of the towers, but not mine. They shimmered against the night, a pattern beyond a single room. My mind exploded with notes, a melody awash with harmonies.
It was time for one last try with Lily Mia.
One chance to free her song before I let her go. I turned to her and offered her my wrists. She plunged into them and drank from me more deeply than she ever had before. My world was pain and stars and spiderweb strands, all swirled together in the dark chocolate madness of my mind. My chest tightened and tears poured from my eyes.
Still, Lily Mia kept pulling me out of myself.
She drank until I was empty. I reached out for her fur, but she was already pulling away. I clutched my bleeding wrists to my chest and collapsed onto the unyielding stone of my tower.
Lily Mia was spinning,
dancing, circling around me and weaving her pattern around my fallen form. Each circle took her farther away from me, out to the edge of the tower. She leapt into the night, trailing threads of crystal behind her. Her body was graceful in flight. She landed on the next tower, attached her threads, and looked back. She was my pain, my art, my love, my life, and she was leaving me. I wanted to call her back, to lean against her one more time. I wanted to bury myself in her fur and find my comfort there. She waited on the next tower, but she did not return. She was waiting for me to say goodbye, to let her go. It was time for her to go and find other spiders, the ones that spun their webs between the towers. She would find a mate and have spiderlings, and one day those spiderlings would inspire someone's art. I didn't care. There would be other spiders for me. She was my first, but not my only, not my last. I knew the truth in my mind, but my heart ached for her. I couldn't let her go. How could I? And yet, how could I keep her here, with all the world beyond us? I raised myself up from the stone, pushed my shoulders back, and saw the design she had woven around me. My outline was clear in the center of the web. I could see the silhouette of my head, my shoulders, my feet. It was my shadow,
woven into Lily Mia's web.
And in the center, the stone was stained with the blood from my wrists. That was what made Gran's gathering box complete. She had put herself into the work, given everything she had. That was the secret, and now that I'd discovered it, I could feel music rising up within me.
I kissed my fingertips and held them out to Lily Mia.
She took off again, leaping further into the night, merging her web into something that was greater than any single pattern. Someday I might compose the symphony of those far-reaching strands, but, for now, I knelt down and touched a single thread. Our song started here,
in the pattern that was all Lily Mia's,
but also all mine.
Lily Mia was free,
and as she disappeared into the distance, I stood in the shadow of my own footprints and sang our song into the night.
Spiders have a bad reputation. You most commonly see them in lists of the top 10 most common phobias, or giggling maniacally as they blow up a mine in one of the best B-movie creature features of recent history, Eight-Legged Freaks. I love how in this story, the spiders are companions, bringing their own unique talents and resources to a symbiotic relationship. Carolyn told us she wrote the story in 2006 while she was at the Clarion West Writers' Workshop. She was recovering from wrist injuries, but still keeping up with the story-a-week pace the program required. The experience of trying to create through the pain of typing or even writing is what inspired the piece. Join us next week for The Tale of the White Tiger by Donald Jacob Eiflucht. Cast of Wonders relies on your donations to pay our authors and bring you the best in young adult audio fiction week after week. If you've enjoyed this story, please consider making a donation using the PayPal link on our website. Every one-time or monthly donation helps, and you have our heartfelt thanks. Share your appreciation for the story by leaving it and us a review on iTunes, or sharing the episode with your family and friends. We're at Cast of Wonders on Twitter. Come say hello. Cast of Wonders is a production of Wolfsbane Publishing and is brought to you by the creative team of Barry J. Northern, our publisher and artist, assistant editor and slush wrangler Jeff Height, and I remain as always your humble editor and host, Marguerite Kenner. Our episodes are released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 international license. Share it, but don't change it. Our theme, Appeal to Heavens, is by Alexei Nov from musicalley.com. Thanks for listening.